As I said before, my name is Howard Laufin. I am professor of history and director of the Center for Austrian Studies here at the University of Minnesota. Very pleased today to work once more with our good friends at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, the interim director, Joe Eggers, and their entire staff for our annual Holocaust Remembrance Day lecture. And I should say right from the start that we're very appreciative of the support for the Badson Fund for Holocaust and Genocide Education for today's talk. I'm even more excited about our guests today. We're really pleased and very fortunate to have my colleague, my friend, Dr. Sarah Cramsey. Dr. Cramsey is professor by special appointment for Central European Studies at Leiden University. She is also director of the Austria Center at Leiden, and her third affiliation is she is an assistant professor of Judaica and diaspora studies as well at Leiden. Dr. Cramsey earned her PhD in 2014 from the University of California at Berkeley. And since that time, she has been a virtual whirlwind of energy, and perhaps most importantly, achievement during this period. I don't have enough time. I don't want to take away from her time today speaking, but let me just highlight really two very important achievements. Perhaps most important is her scholarship. She is the author of Uprooting the Diaspora, Jewish Belonging, and the Ethnic Revolution in Poland and Czechoslovakia, which was published in 2023 by Indiana University Press. Now, this book has been very well received. In fact, it was the 2024, was a finalist for the 2024 Ernst Fraenkel Prize for Best Book in Holocaust Studies. And it also won the Kolchitsky Prize for Best Book in Polish Studies. I'd also, secondly, like to highlight her really remarkable record of grants and fellowships. She has won fellowships and grants from organizations such as the Fulbright Program, Simon Wiesenthal Institute in Vienna, but perhaps most importantly, she is the recipient of a 1.5 million euro grant from the European Research Council. This is functioning as a starting grant for her project Care Century. Now, I'll let her talk a bit more about that project because that's really, I think, quite closely connected to her talk today, which is focusing on her second book. So without any further ado, I think I'll turn things over to Sarah for her talk on the Other Holocaust, Care, Children, and Jewish Catastrophe. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Howard. Howard, maybe you can give me a thumbs up that you hear me, since you're the only face I see at the moment. Thank you. That was such a lovely introduction. It is such a privilege to be the director of the Austria Center Leiden and to be connected with the 9 Austria centers throughout the world, including, of course, the granddaddy of them all, the oldest Austria Center, which is at the University of Minnesota. So it's such a pleasure, Howard. Gary, I see you there, also Gary Cohen in my chat. So it's just a pleasure to see the colleagues that I get to see at our meetings of the Austria Center here in this dark Belgian and Dutch winter that I'm experiencing right now. Meyer has kindly agreed to move the slides for me, so we can start off. Actually, Meyer, you can go back to that first one. Forgive me, I jumped the gun there. I'm here today to tell you something that you already know, which is that care matters, and it matters in many ways. It matters for all of us on an individual level. Our lives are bookended and punctuated by care. But care also matters as a scientific historical concept that is seemingly timeless, always contingent, and a surprisingly underutilized tool in the study of the human past. To put that another way, care is constant, but it's almost always changing. It responds to technological advances, material revolutions, persistent moral assumptions, and shifting political economies. Care is often infused with religious, ethnic, and cultural sensitivities. We create care practices, and care practices transcend us. If we theorize it, care, with a capital C, becomes a social entity that changes in composition over time. Now, when I talk about care these days, I'm usually talking about early childcare, or the care which transpires during the earliest days of human life, in the womb, and for a handful of years after birth. As I look into the abyss of my computer, but know that on the other side of it, there are really wonderful people that are populating this virtual room, and people that I have known for many years, Atlas Lovejoy and Natalie Belsky. It's so wonderful to see you two on the chat list. I know that you've come to this lecture from both near and far, or maybe even in your living room. And I know, just because we're all here together, that all of us received this early childcare. I am certain of that. You all survived that fragile period which begins the human existence. What is uncertain, however, is where historians like myself and others who study the past can find the physical, documentary, and archival proof of that care which sustained you. Because while early childcare is obvious, it is often invisible to the written record. The person receiving that care has no memory of it. Those giving care are consumed by that care and too busy or too tired to often write about it. Caregivers are very often women whose perspective has frequently been marginalized. The work of early childcare is often taboo, it's sometimes quite dirty, and it's largely undocumented. And so the invisible work attached to early childcare is by definition difficult to visualize. That's exactly what I want to try to do today using a specific laboratory. The Jewish Catastrophe in Central and Eastern Europe during the Second World War. Next slide, please. Specifically, I will visualize the invisible work of caretakers who nurtured the very young during the Shoah, the event that came to be known as the Holocaust with a capital H. How will I do this? And I can hear some of you, maybe the historians, asking, so what? Why does this matter? Let me answer those questions now explicitly and hope that in the minutes which follow, I can strengthen those answers with evidence. I will visualize the work of caretakers during the Shoah by reading pre-existing documents in creative ways and by focusing on overlooked voices, spaces, and things that illuminate care in the past. So what? We already know so much about the Holocaust, or the systematic discrimination, uprooting, robbery, starvation, and murdering of European Jews from 1933 to 1945. Why should we think about this event from the standpoint of caretakers and the children who received care? Isn't genocide always gendered? Isn't the decision taken by Nazi officials in the late summer and early fall of 1941 to kill hundreds of thousands of Jewish women and children by bullets on the Eastern Front, as detailed by Christopher Browning and others, isn't this already held up as the moment that the Third Reich crossed the line and became a genocidal state? Am I really telling you something new? In fact, I began this talk by admitting that today I will tell you something that you already know. What else am I contributing to conversations about the Holocaust, about the broader experience of Jews rooted in Central and Eastern Europe, and about the importance of care for the broader study of the human past? Next slide, please. An answer to these complicated questions begins with an honest admission. I've always taught that the Holocaust is unique compared to other genocides on three registers: the long history of anti-Judaism in Christian Europe, the metaphysical nature of the Jew in Nazi ideology, and the pan-European nature of the crime, which implicates so many different actors, from railway operators to machine makers to government officials and ordinary neighbors. But I have begun to realize that this explanation is incomplete. The chronological length, the geographic breadth, and the daily processes that added up to this genocide demand that we pay attention to caretaking as an active relationship and those imbricated in those relationships. The Nazis and some of their collaborators weaponized care and networks attached to care as they perpetrated the Holocaust. I think that this explicit manipulation of care to advance genocide also makes the Holocaust unique in the field of genocide studies. And on a tangent, I am very interested to see how specialists of other genocides integrate care into the narratives that they write. Stemming from this realization, a more specific argument that I'd like to make today is that we should understand the experience of caretaking as being the dominant experience of Jews during the 1940s. And here I understand the word Jews to correspond with those classified as Jewish according to the 1935 Nuremberg laws. Thus, if we are not grappling with the invisible work of care and caretaking, we are not really grappling with the events that added up to this genocide, nor are we representing this past accurately. Beyond this, a focus on care illuminates survival and unsurvival, the extensive uprootedness of Jews across all ages during the 1940s, and finally, the invisible work of care during extraordinary times. In fact, it's precisely during periods of uprooting, displacement, and forced migration that care and care networks become more visible. This holds true for the 3 case studies that I will present today, which all involve Polish Jewish caregivers, those whom they cared for, and some Polish Jews and others attentive to care. These case studies, which happened during the first half of the 1940s, reveal the other Holocaust, or the specific genocide directed at the youngest victims of the Shoah and those who nurtured them. Next slide, please. So moving forward, we will look at this other Holocaust in 3 places: the Warsaw Ghetto, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the wartime Soviet Union. Because of the spread of this survey and the nature of the evidence we will digest, I think it's necessary to say 2 more things before I proceed. 2 things that I often say to my students when I teach about these events. First, the Holocaust happened in different ways in different places. We need to be attentive to local, regional, and global circumstances. And second, we are talking about a very sensitive topic. And within that sensitive topic, we are considering highly sensitive documents and stories. Some of this lecture might be triggering for people, especially those who have suffered pregnancy loss or the loss of a cared-for child. I am familiar with these feelings, and I still think that the emotional stamina required for this work is possible and necessary. This is a perspective that we cannot ignore. Next slide, please. I'll begin this first section on the Warsaw Ghetto, which existed from November 1940 to May 1943, from a very different time and place. On March 3rd, 1961, during the 25th session of the State of Israel's trial against Adolf Eichmann, Zhivia Lubetkin took the stand. She wore a plain collared dress with large buttons that cinched at the waist with the help of a belt. After she was sworn in, she was seated in the witness chair, across from the glass box containing the accused, and next to the table where the chief prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, stood, with his black robe, thin black tie, and crossed arms. With gravity, he asked her, what happened in April 1943, before Easter, before Pesach, unquote. He wanted her to talk about how she and other Polish Jews initiated the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising during Passover, a springtime festival commemorated by Jews annually. Lubetkin swallowed, ran her tongue across her bottom teeth, staring downward for the most part, and twisting her glasses in her hand, she began an answer that is shocking, to say the least. Let me quote her in full. The 18th of April, 1943 was the day before Pesach. 2 days earlier, the Gestapo man Brand walked into the community council office and said that he believed that the council does not take enough care of the Jewish children. There was not enough food, not enough vegetables, and he suggested that kindergartens would be put up so that Jewish children could play and laugh, because it was certain that Jews would remain in Warsaw and should be productive, and that there would be no danger of deportation. We already had experience, and we knew that if there were any rumors, and if there was such a promise, that it was a bad omen. Next slide, please. Rumors reverberated through the ghetto during those heavy April days, which Czesław Miłosz, a non-Jewish Pole who lived on the other side of the ghetto wall, captured so viscerally in his poem, Campo di Fiori, in which Miłosz details how the flames from the burning ghetto passed by the children's carousel in a park on the Aryan side of the city. Even positive rumors, however, did not encourage Lubetkin and other fighters in the ZOB, the Żydowskie Organizacje Bojowe, or Jewish Combat Organization. Further intelligence confirmed what Lubetkin and others already expected. By midnight, on April 18th, the ghetto was surrounded by Nazi German soldiers, readying for intensive battle. Now, to me, this is extraordinary. Advance of the Nazi ground assault on the Warsaw Ghetto, one of the 4 largest urban insurrections in Europe in the 20th century, and the largest insurrection in any part of Nazi-occupied Europe. The Nazi official who liaisoned with the Warsaw Jewish community tried to divert Jewish attention and ameliorate Jewish fears by making promises to improve the lives of Jewish children. This mass manipulation was embedded in the broader Nazi strategy for liquidating the Jewish community of Warsaw, which was the 2nd largest urban settlement of Jews in the world after New York City, and constituted roughly 1/3 of the city's overall population. In Warsaw were also tens of thousands of Jews from elsewhere in Poland who had been resettled there. And perhaps, even more extraordinarily, members of the Jewish fighting organization, like Żywia Lubetkin, were prepared to take up the meager arms they had stored and protected because they heard about a Nazi initiative to reopen kindergartens, give Jewish children more vegetables, and encourage play and laughter within the ghetto walls. Why were these particular rumors understood as a bad omen? When Lubetkin said that she and her comrades already had experience which indicated otherwise, what did she mean? Next slide, please. With this short reference made nearly 2 decades after the event she described, Lubetkin gestured to another confluence of care and catastrophe from the spring and summer of 1942, from privileges given to Jewish children and their relieved caretakers before the so-called Great Deportation uprooted and massacred more than 250,000 Polish Jewish men, women, and children in the gas chambers of Treblinka. In April 1942, architects and engineers confined to the Warsaw Ghetto smoothed the jagged rubble of bombed-out spaces into artificial hills and valleys dotted with trees and flowers. Over the next few months, playgrounds took root in these newly created parks thanks to an initiative of Adam Cherniakov, the president of the Nazi-created Warsaw Judenrat, who was not necessarily remembered in positive terms. Throughout the spring and summer of 1942, diarist and lucky survivor Hillel Seidman, who was also the father of scholar Naomi Seidman, remembered thousands of young children exercising in planned play spaces under the watchful eyes of their teachers. Yes, in April 1942, the Nazis allowed schools to open in the Warsaw Ghetto as well. Next slide, please. As spring became summer, more playgrounds materialized. We know this because Chernyakov followed the process of Warsaw Ghetto playgrounds closely in his diary, which we can read today on screens that we carry in our pockets, because his diary was snuck out of the Warsaw Ghetto and preserved by Polish Jews hiding on the Aryan side and Polish Christians who were sympathetic to the Jewish plight. On June 24th, 1942, for example, Chernyakov inspected the work unfolding at 2 playgrounds. A few weeks later, he recorded the happy news that both spaces would be finished by Sunday, July 12th. At 9:30 in the morning on that day, crowds of people in the street, on roofs, on chimneys and balconies watched the opening of the play area alongside an orchestra, choir, and ballet dances. The children gave Chernyakov an ovation. Reflecting on his presence in play spaces and at these ceremonies, he wrote that many people hold a grudge against me for organizing play activity for the children, for arranging festive openings of playgrounds. I am reminded of a film, a ship is sinking, and the captain, to raise the spirits of the passengers, orders the orchestra to play a jazz piece. I had made up my mind to emulate the captain, unquote. And so, across 4 warming months in 1942, Adam Chernyakov partook in ceremonies steeped in hope for a future that Jewish children in Warsaw could enjoy. Now, those of us who study how the Polish civilization that coalesced in Warsaw began to come to a bloody end know that all this unfolded against a backdrop of other rumors, which hinted at the opposite. There would be no future for the Jews of Warsaw. This tension between these outcomes coexisted until a breaking point in the last week of July, 1942, and would culminate in Chernyakov's protest suicide. 7 days before he died, on July 15th, Chernyakov stopped by a new playground. It was full. On July 16th, Chernyakov recorded a new rumor suggested that imminent deportations from the ghetto would leave only 120,000 people behind, or less than 25% of the existing ghetto population. On Saturday, July 18th, more precise rumors claimed that deportations would begin in just 2 days, on the evening of Monday, July 20th. Erupting panic drove Chernyakov towards 2 things: medication — he took headache powders, pain relievers, and sedatives — and, second, playgrounds. He visited 3 on July 19th as he passed through the entire quarter. Even on the last day of his life, Chernyakov included a reference to playgrounds alongside the horrific instructions that, quote, all the Jews, irrespective of sex and age, with certain exceptions, will be deported to the east. 6,000 Jews were due to the Umschlagplatz at 1600. That number would be a minimum daily quota, unquote. After Chernyakov and the Judenrat received this order from Sturmbannführer Hoffler, they disconnected their telephone and evacuated the children from the playground opposite their headquarters. At some moment thereafter, Chernyakov swallowed poison and died. Next slide, please. Playgrounds and schools engendered optimism and passivity for Chernyakov and others at a particularly meaningful moment, right before the Great Deportation began. This is what, I believe, Zhivia Lubetkin referred to when asked about the timing of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as she sat opposite Adolf Eichmann in 1961. When the Nazis dangled improved care for Jewish children in front of her and her fellow fighters, they knew that this was part of an intentional strategy. Next slide, please. From Warsaw, let us move to another place where the Holocaust happened, Auschwitz-Birkenau. This name is familiar to all of you, I'm sure. Let me clarify a few things about this site, which lies around 3 kilometers away from the main camp, Auschwitz I, which is seen here in a curated photo by one of my students. Auschwitz is the German name of a Polish town, the name of the first and main camp where working prisoners from more than a dozen countries were registered, and also a stand-in for a complex of work, labor, concentration, starvation, and death. There were 40 subcamps in this expansive network, which sits at an important railway junction and next to the town of Oswiecim, where Jews lived for more than 900 years. Next slide, please. We will focus now on Birkenau, a subcamp built in 1941 and 1942, where roughly 1 million people, mainly Jews, met their death by suffocation in 4 gas chambers. For context, 1 out of 6 Jews who died during the Holocaust died at the Auschwitz complex. Drawing on the artwork from a French-Polish Jew named David Olaire, voices from his colleagues in the Sonderkommando, and other writers who experienced Birkenau, we will clearly see that most of the women selected to die in gas-infused chambers experienced their trajectories to death as caregivers, with children in their charge. For some younger, healthy women, their role as a caretaker condemned them to death. Next slide, please. The visceral art of David Olaire forces us where we cannot go, and from where there were almost no survivors, to the threshold of and then inside the gas chambers and crematorium. And when we arrive there, the children command our attention. Faceless, small beings wrapped in adult arms can be seen in one drawing that you're looking at here, sketched soon after unconditional surrender. In a 1945 plan of Birkenau's crematorium number 3, at least 3 of those standing in the gas chamber in the bottom right-hand corner appear to be holding miniature versions of themselves. They stand below 5 ovens, a room for the extraction of gold teeth, an area for the collection of hair, and bunks assigned to the Sonderkommando, who witnessed and became part of the final mechanisms of systematic murder. David Olaire could visualize this multi-level complex because he had been a slave of the crematorium himself for almost 2 years, beginning on March 2nd, 1943, when train convoy number 49 arrived in Auschwitz from Drancy in France. A highly regarded artist and naturalized French citizen who had been born in Warsaw in 1902, Olaire was arrested in a roundup near Paris on February 20th, 1943, and deported in a cattle car that chugged for roughly 1,500 kilometers eastward, back towards occupied lands, which used to belong to the Second Polish Republic. After the war, he returned to France and shifted his gaze to Birkenau itself, perhaps to convince his disbelieving wife, who nursed him back to health with spoonfuls of pureed food, of what he had seen. Next slide, please. Toys and baby bottles appear frequently in his work, sometimes clutched in the hands of live offspring and sometimes discarded. A sketch entitled "I Watch the SS" that can be found in the ghetto fighter's house in Israel includes goods destined for tiny mouths. Framed by the boots and legs of a guard, this drawing shows Olaire as a Sonderkommando with life-saving access to things surrendered by those destined for the gas chambers, things brought on the many-day or many-week-long train trip to Birkenau: a baguette, a box of aspirin, suitcases and bags, and then, prominently, a baby bottle and a plump pacifier. A similar scene is captured on the left of this slide, in color, in David Olaire collecting food, next to an abandoned pair of boots, a gaping cloth bag with kosher meat, a thin baguette, an apple, other perishable goods. Cast off next to this bag is a small barefoot doll with a yellow dress and blue hair ribbon, and then a long baby bottle filled with milk. Next slide, please. Things like this were discarded in the grass near the gas chambers. We can see evidence of this in the so-called Auschwitz album as well, which remains the only photographic proof of an arrival to Birkenau destined for work or death. This retention of carry-on items kept caretakers and those around them calm. Sometimes these goods were carried into the antechamber of the gas chamber, as seen here in a sketch called "In the Undressing Room of Crematorium 3, which was made in 1946. A rectangular room replete with benches, hooks for discarded clothing, large pipes, a pillar and industrial lights, contains 2 guards with rifle that steer the naked and almost naked people, 7 women, and 5 children. The only character in the scene who we meet eye to eye is a child in the right corner of our view. When I first saw this picture, I knew that I had to write a book about care during the Holocaust. I also had a hunch that other Sonderkommando would provide me with details about the invisible work of this care at the end of life. One Sonderkommando prisoner named Josef Sacker remembered that people carried their parents in their arms and 10-year-olds carried babies in their arms, unquote. The disrobing happened in shifts, and leading 2,000 people to the full capacity gas chamber took about an hour. Alongside the clothes, Sonderkommando charged with cleaning up the debris of the living often found food, eggs, meat, and fruit, both fresh and dried. Sacker remembered that many came with little children and had to feed them. They didn't know whether and when they would be given something to eat, unquote. Next slide, please. Care, what we might even call miraculous care, continued even within the gas chamber as caretakers expired and lifeless bodies collapsed upon one another. On an otherwise normal day, filled with transport arrivals, Sonderkommando prisoner Shlomo Venenzia recalled hearing a strange noise as they removed bodies from the chamber. This was not abnormal. Bodies, Venenzia explained, continued to emit gas, the so-called death rattle. But then, the group working listened closely and realized the wailing was the crying of a newborn baby. Barely 2 months old, Venenzia estimates the baby was, quote, still clinging to her mother's breast and vainly trying to suckle. She was crying because she could feel that the milk had stopped flowing, unquote. Perhaps the baby girl was the same size as the one tethered to her caretaker on the left in this gruesome drawing by David O'Leary. Venenzia's colleague brought the baby out of the gas chamber. We knew, Venenzia remembered, it would be impossible to keep her with us. Impossible to hide her or get her accepted by the Germans. Once a guard saw the baby, he shot it, and that little girl who had miraculously survived the gas was dead. This episode reaffirmed for Venenzia the inevitability of death at Birkenau, what child survivor and historian Otto de Kolka calls the immutable law in his gripping memoir, Landscapes of the Metropolis of Death. But Venenzia did survive his work with the Sonderkommando. Like O'Leary, he orbited away from planet Auschwitz, a phrase that takes important resonance in a new book from my colleague, Dr. Kate Brackney. Venenzia survived, and many years later, he asked the head of the largest pediatric hospital in Rome how that baby could have survived. According to this doctor, quote, it was not impossible that the child, as she suckled, was insulated by the strength with which she was sucking at her mother's breast, which would have limited the absorption of the deadly gas, unquote. Venenzia once shared this story with school children after one small girl asked him if anyone survived the gas chamber. Yes, but only one. Next slide, please. David O'Leary's artistic attention even focused on life not yet born. Tucked into a formed belly, a diaphanous breached fetus is left of center in this difficult scene. Entitled Gassing, this large blue, gray, brown, red painting shows a bloodied canister of Zyklon B emitting gas that ensnarls roughly 17 people in an agonizing state. With open mouths and sometimes open eyes, their naked limbs twist towards each other. The memories of Sonderkommando Leg Langfuss, which were scribbled on precious paper and buried in the ground near the crematorium, corroborate this entanglement. Quote, falling down dead in such a confined space, the people pressed against each other in 5 or 6 layers, one on top of the other, to over a meter in height, unquote. He also noticed that, quote, mothers were left sitting on the ground, clutching their children, men and women hugging each other, unquote. Was this expectant mother in this picture, we might ask, pregnant when she arrived at Birkenau? Or Like the mother of Otto Kolka, did she conceive at Auschwitz? Naomi Seidman's work reminds us that intentional sex, pregnancy, and birth happened even in the most desperate locations during the Shoah. Other fetuses figure in my research on care as well. In the 1980s, for example, the Conference for Material Claims Against Germany struck an agreement with the West German government about a new classification of Holocaust survivors, the so-called fetus category. Thus, babies born to Jewish mothers, even after May 1945, were eligible for survival benefits. More than 2,500 claims in the fetus category have been approved for reparation payments. It's impossible, of course, to know how many fetuses were killed at Birkenau. What we do know, as scholar and survivor Ruth Kluger reminds us, only the Jewish and Roma children died in the gas chambers en masse. Next slide, please. Ruth Kluger had other things to say about childcare in the Auschwitz universe which are relevant here. She was a child herself when she arrived in Birkenau with her mother. They had a complicated relationship, and Kluger did not want observers of the Holocaust or any past to idealize care relationships based on biology. The texture of family relations, she wrote, becomes progressively more threadbare when people have to put up with more, unquote. Still, she contended that family obligations precluded some behavior like child abandonment. She used a critique of a fictional scene written by Polish Sonderkommando Tadeusz Borowski to make her point. In his short story, This Way to the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, Tadeusz Borowski visualizes a youthful Jewish mother arriving at Birkenau, and then attempting to abandon her child, even as the child chases after her. Borowski acknowledges in his text, the mother wanted to live. Like Borowski and fellow prisoner Imre Kertész, Kluger also wrote about this moment of arrival on the deportation ramp at Birkenau. She called it a blind alley of civilization gone berserk, unquote. She stood on a different deportation ramp than this one in this slide, which dates from spring 1944 and is pictured in the Auschwitz album. But I think that the visual helps. For Kluger, the scene detailed by Borowski about the mother abandoning her offspring was unconvincing from two perspectives. First, as a woman who was a 12-year-old girl at that time on that very ramp, and one who lived for the rest of the war among older female prisoners. She said this in honor of the Jewish mothers who died and those who were kind to the children of other women. Leaning on Ruth Kluger and the members of the Sonderkommando like David O'Lear, perhaps we should read the majority experience of female caretakers and their charges as an apogee of human caregiving. Hundreds of thousands of Janusz Korczaks who have not been remembered, which says gusto or commemoration. Next slide, please. An irony of the Second World War is that more Polish Jews survived outside of Polish territory than on it. Around 250,000 Jews with Polish citizenship spent this conflict in the Soviet Union, alongside 1 million non-Jewish Polish citizens. As they moved around and lived in the Soviet Union indefinitely, this largely young population decided that wartime was also a good time to start or grow a family. By the time hundreds of thousands returned to post-war Poland in 1946, statistics that I have found in the Szczecin City Archive indicate that 1 out of 4 Polish Jews was under the age of 7, and 1 out of 8 was under the age of 2. Perhaps that was why Miriam Storch said, "The time in the Soviet Union was hard, but not for the reason that you think. It was hard because we had to constantly take care of children," unquote. Children like the son of Esther Berkowitz, who was born on the weeks-long train trip that sent her and her husband from the western fringes of the expanded Soviet Union to a labor installation in Siberia. When she realized that she was in labor, the Soviets stopped the train and took her to a hospital where she gave birth. Her father-in-law became a primary caretaker of Daniel, her son. She had her second child in 1945. At labor installations, pregnant women often stayed behind with older women and older men to care for the children as the parents worked hard physical jobs. Polish Jewish women had to lean on others in the absence of strong family or communal ties. A local midwife, for example, taught Doris Aberstel to squeeze lemon juice into the mouths of breastfeeding children to strengthen the nutritional value of mother's milk. Women like Frida Waltzman were instructed by local Kazakhs to breastfeed their children for 2 years to ensure their nutritional strength, longer than what was customary in interwar Poland, and shorter than the upper limit of 5 years recommended by some rabbis in Mishnah and Talmud. Next slide, please. It took Central Asian villages to raise these children. Polish Jewish women, often expected to work in the Soviet labor system, left kids in daycares, at orphanages for the day, or with members of family, both biological and non-biological. 60 years after the war, Ruzhena Berler, who you can see here in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, that's the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, Ruzhena Berler cherished a picture of Anastasia, who cared for her daughter. Decades after their time in the Soviet Union, dozens of parents, both mothers and fathers, remembered that train stations, important centers for the exchange of goods and information, almost always had rooms for babies, with hot water, cleaning products, and a space for nursing mothers. In times of scarcity, things attached to babies were often hard to procure, but not necessarily impossible. The black market provided a space to sell. Frida Waltzman's nightgown bought a month's worth of food in Jambul, and the opportunity to buy. Rachel Koplowitz used earnings made by her husband, a tailor for the Red Army, to buy a cot for her child. You can see Rachel Koplowitz here in the upper left-hand corner of the slide. Her memories also reveal the continued observance of religious laws with a modern twist. After her son Jackie was born in 1944, an unnamed Russian midwife helped her find a mole who ritually circumcised her son. Then she took her son to be photographed professionally in the village of Langer Ugel. 5 decades later, nearing the end of a 2-hour, 20-minute interview conducted in the Bronx, she shared the image with posterity, and I'm sharing it with you here. There, held in front of the camera at a tilted angle, was a picture of her naked son. Knitted booties covered his toes. Some kind of plant sat behind him. A lacy cloth separated his bare bottom from the table, and natural light streamed in from the left. This, she said, is a picture of my 3-month-old son, circumcised. I wanted proof to send to my parents that I circumcised my son, unquote. Her parents never saw it. They were probably already exterminated when the picture was taken close to Tashkent. Remnants of early childcare, in voices in spaces that no longer exist, and in the things that continue to be carried, infuse the experience of Polish Jews who survived the Second World War in the Soviet Union. Next slide, please. As I tack towards the end of this lecture, I'd like to state that there is much more to consider when we talk about this other Holocaust. Some of my colleagues like Kasia Pearson, Joanna Sliva, Mary Fraser Kirsch, Francesca Lamp, and Rebecca Clifford have written about care in convents and monasteries, about care that was care until it was not safe to have a Jewish child in your midst, about care workers who worked in ghetto daycares, about caregivers who shuffled children off into the night and picked them up in the bleary light of early dawns, about care that succeeded and care that failed, and about the extension of care networks after 1945. When you start to think about the Holocaust through the lens of care, it is hard to stop. And of course, questions about care transcend the Holocaust and the 1940s, dissecting the entirety of the human past. I've just given a lecture on the Holocaust, but I am not solely a historian of the Holocaust. I am first and foremost a historian of Central and Eastern Europe. This diverse, fascinating, and complicated region It's connected to my special chair at Leiden and has been intimately connected to my life since I first took a course with Professor Laurie Kowalski at the College of William and Mary in Virginia in the year 2000. Within this space that extends from Salzburg to St. Petersburg and Sarajevo, I focus on the unique and complicated Jewish civilization that was rooted, for better or worse, here for hundreds of years, until, at some point, it wasn't anymore. I use this word civilization intentionally. This was a rooted diaspora that belonged to this space, despite the persistence of Jewish otherness. In fact, as Milan Kundera reminds us in his 1984 essay, The Tragedy of Central Europe, it is impossible to write about Central Europe without engaging with the Jewish voices, which reverberated through this region. The Nazis, their collaborators, and on a smaller but significant scale, some post-war actors who decided that Jewish survivors should be destined for a Jewish polity in the Middle East, uprooted an entire civilization. This, in fact, is the argument I make in my first book, Uprooting the Diaspora. If my favorite Yiddish saying, ein Mensch ist eine Welt mit kleinen Welterns, a person is a world filled with little worlds. If this is true, the void left by 6 million deaths is cosmic in scale. This is why the concepts of culture and civilization are embedded into Raphael Lemkin's original definition of genocide, which he coined in 1944. Lemkin wrote about both Polish Christians and Polish Jews. He spoke about the Czechs under Nazi rule and the Armenians slaughtered by the Ottomans as well. The crime of genocide is not only a crime against a people, it's a crime against that people's culture, that people's past, and that people's future. When the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted by the UN General Assembly at the end of 1948, 2 of the 5 preconditions for genocide directly related to the care for the very young. Measures that were intended to prevent births in a group and forcibly transferring children. For Raphael Lemkin, genocide was also a biological crime waged against a civilization's children. I'd like to continue to think about this word civilization for just another moment or two. In the early 1950s, Czesław Miłosz, who I quoted earlier, recognized that the bonds of civilization are fragile. Over the past few years, I have thought about this word, fragile. In Polish, it's kruci. And linking this word to the idea of civilization, I've thought about this many times. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as the war between Ukraine and Russia continues, on October 7th, 2023, and in the dizzying months and years that have followed, as I look for updates on the situation in Sudan, which seem very far from the front page of the newspapers I read, and finally, as political developments in my old home, the United States, and my new homes, Belgium and the Netherlands, put increasing pressure on the fragile bonds, linking me to others and linking all of us to a shared human civilization. If I pause and marinate there, the despair can be overwhelming. But then I remember which bonds are really holding our civilization or any civilization together. And I think of care, hard work, constant work, work of the flesh, to borrow from the historian Jill Lepore. And I realize that the magic keeping the stars apart in that E.E. Cummings poem is not only love, but more precisely care. Care that we are willing to give, especially to those fragile little ones in our midst and in our universe. And I would like to take this opportunity today to recommit to a promise that I made at the beginning of my appointment as the director of the Austria Center Leiden, that I will use the privilege of my chair And it is a privilege for me to be in the position that I am and to be able to talk to all of you fine people today. I will use the privilege of my chair to support other histories that excavate what is fragile, invisible, and overlooked, as well as the brave storytellers, regardless of institutional affiliation or presumed inherited background, who make us reconsider what we think about the Central European past and about our own complex world. Increasingly, to me, the work of historians should emulate the work of poets. Poets like my favorite, Wisława Szymborska, who so eloquently reminds us that in the language of poetry, where every word is weighed, nothing is usual or normal. Not a single stone and not a single cloud above it, not a single day and not a single night after it, and above all, not a single existence, not anyone's existence in the world, unquote. Next slide, please. Or as another poet, Dr. Seuss, inspires me and my daughters, a person's a person, no matter how small. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for these wonderful comments and that really important reminder about the fragility of our work of excavating. So timely, so appropriate for this. So we do have time for questions now, and we would ask you to use I think there's a Q&A box at the bottom to type in your questions there, and we'll try to get to them all, or as many as we can in this time. Perhaps I should start as you take the time to begin to for whatever questions you might have. And Sarah, if I could ask you perhaps maybe two sort of different directions. One, maybe to contextualize your project within this broader project of care century that I mentioned at the beginning. Perhaps the second, you mentioned him only in passing, and for many people, well, for the Poles, he's a national hero, Korczak. But when I think of care, from someone completely outside the field, and especially in the Polish context, this individual. So I was asking, perhaps you could say a little bit more about him. I'm not sure if all in our audience are familiar with him, but how this very emblematic figure, who is very, very well known, of course, in the Polish context, fits into your own work and thinking about care for this specific purpose.
Sure. Howard, I expected nothing but excellent questions from you. So thank you very much for those two questions. Let me start with the second one. Who is Janusz Korczak? Janusz Korczak is a psychologist who did lots of work with children in interwar Warsaw. And he specifically had an orphanage where he cared for children. And he is one of the first psychologists to specialize on children. And he specifically thought that it was very important to kind of look at children and try to understand them on their own terms. Sometimes to an American audience, I'll call him like a Fred Rogers, but with a PhD in psychology. If we're thinking back to Mr. Rogers, right? It's not shocking to me that that name rang a bell for you. And I think it's also really emblematic of what I'm trying to do with my with the excavating work that I'm trying to do of both existing materials and then looking in archives to try to find voices, spaces, and things that tell us about care. The most well-known caretaker that we associate with children during the Holocaust is a man. And that's because the story of how he went with the children in the orphanage that he was leading in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he refused to abandon them. He was offered the chance to kind of leave, but no, he went with the children during the Great Deportation, and he went with them to Treblinka to keep them calm. And Emanuel Ringelblum, in fact, is writing about this in his 1944 work, Polish-Jewish Relations During the Second World War. This also appears in the Onyx Shabas archive within the Warsaw Ghetto as well. So we have this idea of this person, Janusz Korczak, and this selfless care right, that he's giving to the children that are part of this orphanage in Warsaw. And I understand that he, movies have been made about him in Israel. In fact, he's a very, very important figure. Less known is his colleague Stefania Wilczek, who also traveled with him and worked with him and worked with children as well. So I think this speaks to just kind of a broader way about the way that history has been written and the way that we tend to think about the past. Not, of course, to take the work that he did or this sacrificial end to his life and say that this is meaningless. No, no, much to the contrary. I think that we should spend more time excavating this type of care, and specifically to recognize that this is one example, and there are hundreds of thousands, if not a million other examples of similar caretaking right up until the end of life, and self-sacrifice with regards to with very young children who are often kind of destined in some way, even more bluntly than an adult would be to death during these circumstances. Related to your first question, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about this new project that I've just started with the European Research Council. So the project is called A Century of Care, Early Childcare and Invisible Work in Central and Eastern Europe from 1905 to 2004. And what I do in this project and the funding that I get from the European Research Council allows me to build a team of both postdocs and PhD students to do research, to try to understand within the Austro-Hungarian Empire and then 6 of its successor states how there are different approaches to very, very early childcare on the familial level, on the societal level, on the communal level, and then also at the state level. If we take this question of the first 1,000 days of human life and we see how much work, both invisible and visible, that it takes to kind of keep these children alive, the question that I'm asking in this research grant is, how do we understand how what is timeless seemingly changes across historical time? So by looking at a period of 100 years, by looking at like a very, very broad geographic spread, which is going to allow me to look at many different religious and ethnic and national communities, I hope to answer some questions about early childcare and how approaches to early childcare change over a 100-year period within the 20th century.
Terrific, thank you. I think the emphasis that you're putting on there, that you made at the beginning of your talk too, about the contingency of care, something that we often assume is a timeless idea that really remains impervious to change, and how you're going to try to contextualize it and look at it in specific contexts and specific historical periods is going to be a really important contribution. So thank you. We do have one question as well, thinking about care more generally, and coming up, I think, to a very, very appropriate contemporary situation that we find ourselves in, particularly right now in the United States. Do you have any strategic advice in the U.S. for those who are concerned about children and who are being deported and left behind without their caregivers? What is the most effective way to counteract this cruelty right now? I mean, obviously, that's a huge question. But as a scholar, in some ways, you may have some ideas about this, and in one way of how individuals in the scholarly community.
Yes, of course. I thank you very much for the question. I'll start off by saying that not only am I not necessarily an expert on what's happening now, and if we think about temporality and how we think about time, we notice that time tends to speed up sometimes, and I feel like we're living at a time right now where time seems to be happening very quickly, where there are lots of different things that are changing. So not only am I not an expert on kind of what's happened today, I'm also no longer living in the United States. So that kind of isolates me, I think, from some of the important conversations that are happening. But just, to speak more generally, I think one of the most important things that we can do is to remain informed and to look at the documents that we have access to very closely and to try to understand like what narratives are in those documents that aren't necessarily being told. And I have noticed that it's very, very important to support people who are producing those narratives. And so I think at a very, very basic level, you should look at who exactly is reporting, giving good, nuanced reporting on this particular issue, find out where they work, or if they have a Substack, subscribe to it. If they work at a newspaper, get a digital subscription to that newspaper, even if you don't live in that area, because I think supporting the people that will tell us these important stories that often are invisible, that often don't kind of make the front page in a systematic or a very nuanced way is incredibly important. So I just think from that standpoint, having information that is accurate and nuanced, and also having people who are interested and able to kind of tell those stories to connect us with what is, quote unquote, really happening on the ground is really important.
Very good. We have a comment from another individual who has been a guest at our talk today. You mentioned the Jewish mother who separated herself from her child because she wanted to live. My mother describes the selection at Stutthof and how her little sister was sent to the death line and my grandmother was sent to the other line. My grandmother switched lines in order to stay with her young daughter to the end at Birkenau. We cannot judge anyone's decisions or choiceless choices during these or those horrific times.
Thank you very much for the question. I think you might have misunderstood me. In fact, I was commenting on what Ruth Kluger, who is a PhD in literature and a Holocaust survivor herself, was saying about a story that was written by another person who had been imprisoned at Birkenau, Tadeusz Borowski. And in fact, Ruth Kluger agrees with you, agrees with this family story that you have so generously shared with us. Ruth Kluger said that she could not imagine a mother wanting to separate herself from her child, right? So in terms of, I didn't necessarily give my perspective on what I think about whether Tadeusz Borowski's story about the mother abandoning her child is true or not. What I was interested in revealing is this tension, that there's this tension, right, between this idea that that if you have a very young child, the chances that then you would be sent to death are higher than if you would be an able-bodied, working, presumably single woman. And one of the things that I'm hoping to complicate, the stories that I'm hoping to complicate, is exactly what you raise here, which is that we really need to be careful about trying to understand representations of this choice, which of course is a choice that I think we can all agree is one of these choiceless choices. But just to make a statement about this idea of judging. Okay, as a historian, I'm in a much more privileged position than a judge or a jury or a lawyer or somebody who is in some kind of a court of law or the moral universe, the court of the moral universe. My goal is to find historical truth. So my goal is not to judge or say, you know, this person did this and this is then X or Y, good or bad, et cetera, et cetera. My idea is to understand the nuance of those choices. So I agree with you that these choiceless choices, that they're very, very important. And my job is not necessarily to judge them. It's to understand the range of options and to really begin to understand some of these very, very delicate situations that just make us weep inside if we think about applying them to our own lives, or if we think about other people having to make some of these horrible decisions and live through these circumstances.
Very good. Thank you. We have a question from Natalie Belsky. Thank you for this amazing talk. I wanted to ask you to speak a bit more about your sources and how you deal with the challenge of memory, especially when dealing with accounts of survivors who were children at the time.
Sure, of course. Hi, Natalie. Those of you that aren't familiar with the work of my colleague, Professor Natalie Belsky, you should definitely check out her work, especially if you're interested on what was going on within the Soviet Union during the time period that dovetailed with the Holocaust and the Second World War. So sources, well, this is really difficult when you're dealing with invisible work, work that often is undocumented. How do you find sources that are going to reveal to you what is often unrevealed, which is the day-to-day monotonous work that sometimes seems like very unhistorically significant of taking care of a very young child? And the way that I try to do that, and I try to do that in this presentation, was using voices, spaces, and things, reading existing documents, like, for example, the transcript of the Adolf Eichmann trial, trying to understand what Zivia Lubetkin is saying, reading it alongside the diary of Hillel Seidman, reading it along the diary of Adam Cherniakov, taking that and thinking about the other work that I know that has been done on the Onek Shabbos archive or within the Warsaw Ghetto itself by some of our scholar friends, some of our colleagues and our friends, and really thinking, how can I use these documents in innovative ways? That's one of the things that led me to look at David O'Leary's paintings very closely, to try to zoom in on them and to really try to understand some of the things that were happening within his paintings, and using these paintings, which we might not think is like the best lens to think about care. But once I started looking at his paintings, I began to realize these paintings are all about care. It just required that I kind of have that lens, have that idea that I need to think about that as I'm looking at these paintings and these drawings. And once I began to look at his entire collection, I began to see that care was incredibly obvious in a way that it wasn't to me before I kind of thought about that particular lens. And I think this question of memory is so incredibly important when we use oral testimonies. I did quote one child that was in a memoir, in a testimony context. So Ruth Kluger was writing when I spoke about what she was remembering as a 12 and 13 and 14-year-old girl. I mentioned Miriam Storch, who was I think 13 years old in 1941, and so then was like in her late teens by the end of the war. But I lean very heavily on the work, for example, of Christopher Browning and the work that he has done remembering survival and trying to understand a bit more about how memory works and also how it works across time. So whenever I'm working with a testimony with somebody that I might find in the Fortunoff archive or at the Shoah Foundation archive, I try to see if I can find multiple interviews with this person to see if they're talking about things multiple times. Another thing that I found, which is so important when we think about early childcare, is some of the vivid things that you might remember within the context of like the first 2 years of human life. Or for example, the birth story. So when I mentioned Esther Berkowitz, who I managed to actually see two testimonies that she gave across a span of years. So I was able to compare from one to the other to see to what extent her story was similar or that it changed. You know, what's interesting to me about birth stories in particular is these are stories that are retold and retold and retold within families. My older daughter, Salome, who you saw her picture, she constantly asks, she just asked me last night to tell the story again about the night she was born. Right. And we can ask, to what extent is the narrative that I'm giving her, which kind of always makes me look very good and always, you know, kind of makes her father look like he's maybe being a little less generous. To what extent is this true? Right. Where is the truth and how we weigh those narratives? And I think that's such an important question, but I don't want that question to completely erase the existence of a particular testimony or a particular document, right? Because already what I'm trying to unearth is so hard to find that I'm really kind of holding on to the evidence in a very, very precious way. I'm still weighing it. I'm still working to corroborate it. I'm trying to see if there were other babies, for instance, who were circumcised in Langer Ugal. Jenny Balsam's son was also circumcised in Langer Ugal. So the minute I'm able to find certain patterns or to look at testimonies across time, looking into family archives. For this project, I've had the opportunity to really dig into family archives, like the family archive of Ari Kubovi, who was the director of Yad Vashem for many years. He was also an ambassador from the State of Israel to South America and Eastern Europe. He also worked for the World Jewish Congress during the 1940s, which is an organization that I've done quite a bit of research in. How can I delve into family archives and use those alongside the traditional archives that are maybe more accessible or more public, in order to kind of make sure that the stories that I'm telling have gone through rigorous historical analysis?
Great, good. Perhaps one more question. I'm sure that even after Dr. Cramsey answers this question, that if you would like to get in touch with her, we can facilitate that as well if you have further follow-ups. But one final question for our talk today is from a guest who asks, how do you think that child care during the Holocaust changed the way child care was provided after the war in Jewish families?
So this is a great question. And I'm very grateful that the European Research Council recently awarded me 1.5 million euro to assemble a team to travel to archives, to have some relief from teaching at Leiden, so that I have the time and the resources and the mind space to really think about this question. I think one way that I can tell you, and the project Care Century, I'd be so happy, Howard, too, as well, to come back at another time and talk more about that project specifically in childcare over like a 100-year period. So if there's interest, you can, of course, keep that in mind for a future talk. But specifically with regards to Jewish families, one of the things that's really important to keep in mind is this lack of familial expectations and intelligence that is often passed down from generations when children are born. So if any of you have had a child, or if any of you were a child, you might recognize that your parents and your grandparents, or your parents, if you're, that parents and grandparents often disagree about certain things. Okay, so it's not even that the transmission of knowledge is always agreed upon knowledge. But one of the things that you begin to see, especially with people who survive, people that are, for instance, having babies then in displaced persons camps. So after the war, there's this baby boom, right? I actually think that the baby boom begins during the war, especially for Polish Jews that are living in the Soviet Union. But, in the 1940s and the 1950s, many survivors decide that this is a great way to kind of get back to normalcy, to have a baby and to have children. Heda Kovali, for instance, talks about this in her memoir, her beautiful memoir, Under a Cruel Star. And she talks about the happiest moment of her life is so easy for her to pinpoint. It's the moment that they laid her baby boy in her arms, and she felt that her dead parents and her dead grandmother, all who had been killed during the Holocaust, were in the hospital room with her. But then she goes on to talk about how because she doesn't have her parents, because she doesn't have her grandmother, she has no idea what to do in terms of raising this baby. So she's hiring people to live in her home. She's relying on a non-Jewish Czech neighbor who knew her parents before, who becomes kind of like a surrogate mother in some ways to kind of help her take care of her son. So because you have this kind of often a lack of familial transmission of knowledge, it's really forcing Jewish survivors to go outside of like traditional Jewish familial networks or communal networks to get information about how to raise a child. And one of the questions that continues to baffle me about early childcare, and I hope that my explorations on this question will yield some definitive answers. How do we disentangle intentional religious belief from inherited cultural practice? And I think that's a really important question when we talk about the Jewish experience, not only in the 1940s and not only in the 20th century, but throughout historical time. There's a wonderful debate that is being kept alive by scholars like Elisheva Baumgarten and Dina Aronoff, who are talking about how do you transmit, quote unquote, Judaism to your children? Is it something that happens through lullabies in the mother's arms? Is it happening through breastfeeding? Or does it happen when the baby is old enough to go to the synagogue with the father? Or does it happen for the boy when he has his bar mitzvah? So these very, very interesting questions. And I think anonymous attendee who asked me this question at 8:11, thank you. This is, I think, a really important question for us continue to entangle, to not expect that childcare is going to be as timeless as it may seem. Another, just very briefly, another really big change that happens after the war is that many more babies are born in hospital settings, especially babies that are born in displaced persons camps. Like my colleague and friend, Iya Lablanovich, who was born in a children's hospital in Vienna because his mother is a displaced person coming back from the Soviet Union, okay? His mother was not born in a hospital, nor his father, okay? If we look at the 20th century, I might find that the most important trajectory influencing early childcare is the increase in the hospitalization of births. That could be the most important trajectory, really kind of defining how childcare changes. But for Jewish survivors in the late 1940s, most of them, the majority of them, are having babies in hospitals when they themselves had not necessarily been born in a hospital themselves.
Very good. Well, thank you. Let's all join in a sort of virtual round of applause for Sarah and her wonderful presentation today and her very exciting project. So this maybe we'll have to have a sequel in just a bit for you to come back and share with us what you found about the contingency of care through change over time. So thank you very much. We thank our audience here. We thank our sponsors as well.